Hi, it's Maria from Still Dreaming Homestead. Glad you're back with me. And we're continuing to read in our book, Farmer Boy by Laura Ingalls Wilder. We're getting very close to the end of this book. Today's chapter is called Mr. Thompson's Pocketbook. Well, that's not a pocketbook that picture was. It looks like hay to me. Father had so much hay that year that the stock could not eat it all, so he decided to sell some of it in town. He went to the woods and brought back a straight, smooth ash log. He hewed, that means cut off, the bark from it, and then with a wooden maul, he beat the log, turning it and pounding it until it softened the layer of wood that had grown last summer and loosened the thin layer of wood underneath it, which had grown the summer before. Then with his knife he cut long gashes from end to end, about 1.5 inches apart, and he peeled off that tight, tough layer of wood in strips about 1.5 inches wide. Those were called ash withes. When Almanzo saw them piled on the big barn floor, he guessed that Father was going to bale hay, and he asked, "Be you going to need any help?" Father's eyes twinkled. "Yes, son," he said. "You can stay home from school. You won't learn hay baling any younger." Early the next morning, Mr. Weed, that's a funny name, Mr. Weed the hay baler came with his press, and Almanzo helped to set it up in the big barn floor. It was a stout wooden box, as long and wide as a bale of hay, but 10 feet high. Its cover could be fastened on tightly. Its bottom was loose. 2 iron levers were hinged to the loose bottom, and the levers ran on little wheels on iron tracks going out from each end of the box. The tracks were like small railroad tracks, and the press was called a railroad press. It was a new, fine machine for baling hay. In the barnyard, Father and Mr. Webb set up a capstan with a long sweep on it. A rope from the capstan went through a ring under the hay press and was tied to another rope that went to the wheels at the end of the levers. Then everything was ready. Almanzo hitched Bess to the sweep. Father pitched hay into the box, and Mr. Weed stood in the box and trampled it down till the box could hold no more. Then he fastened the cover on the box, and Father called, "All right, Almanzo." Almanzo slapped Bess with the lines and shouted, "Giddy up, Bess." Bess began to walk around the capstan, and the capstan began to wind up the rope. The rope pulled the ends of the levers towards the press, and the inner ends of the levers pushed its loose bottom upward. The bottom slowly rose, squeezing the hay. The rope creaked and the box groaned till the hay was pressed so tight it could not be pressed any tighter. Then Father shouted, "Whoa!" and Almanzo shouted, "Whoa, Bess." Father climbed up in the hay press and ran ash withes through the narrow cracks in the box. He pulled them tight around the bale of hay and knotted them firmly. Mr. Weed unfastened the cover, and up popped a bale of hay, bulging between the tight ash withes. It weighed 250 pounds, but Father lifted it easily. Then Almanzo and Mr. Weed reset the press. Almanzo unwound the rope from the capstan, and they began to make another bale of hay. All day they worked, and that night Father said they had baled enough. Almanzo sat at the supper table wishing he did not have to go back to school. He thought about figuring, and he was thinking so hard that words came out of his mouth before he knew it. 30 bales to a load at $2 a bale, he said. That's $60 a... He stopped and stared. He knew better than to speak at the table when he wasn't spoken to. Mercy on us, Mother said. Well, well, said Father. I see you've been studied to some purpose. He drank the tea out of his saucer, set it down, and looked again at Almanzo. Learning is best put into practice. What say you ride into town with me tomorrow and sell that load of hay? Oh, yes, please, Father, Almanzo almost shouted. He did not have to go to school next morning. He climbed high on the top of a load of hay and sat there on his stomach and kicked up his heels. Father's hat was down below him and beyond were the plump backs of the horses. He was as high up as if he were in a tree. The load swayed a little and the wagon creaked and the horses' feet made dull sounds on the hard snow. The air was clear and cold, the sky was very blue, and all the snowy fields were sparkling. Just beyond the bridge over Trout River, Almanzo saw a small black thing laying in the road. When the wagon passed, he leaned over the edge of the hay and saw that it was a pocketbook. He yelled, and Father stopped the horses to let him climb down and pick it up. It was a fat, black wallet. Almanzo shimmied up the bales of hay, and the horses went on. He looked at the pocketbook. He opened it. It was full of banknotes. There was nothing to show who owned it. He handed it down to Father, and Father gave him the reins. The team seemed far below, with the lines slanting down to the arms, and Almanzo felt very small. He liked to drive. He held the lines carefully, and the horses went steadily along. Father looked at the pocketbook and at the money. There's $1,500 here, Father said. Now, who does it belong to? He's a man who's afraid of banks, or he wouldn't carry so much money around. You can see by the creases in the bills he's carried some of them for a long time. They're big bills, folded together, so likely he got them all at once. Now, who's suspicious and stingy and sold something valuable lately? Crazy dogs? Almanzo didn't know, but Father didn't expect him to answer. The horses went around a curve in the road as well as if Father had been driving. Thompson, Father exclaimed. He sold some land last fall. He's afraid of banks. He's suspicious and so stingy he'd skid a flea for its hide and tallow. Thompson's the man. He put the pocketbook in his pocket and took the lines from Almanzo. We'll see if we can find him in town, he said. Father drove first to the livery, sale and feed stable. The livery man came out, and sure enough, Father let Almanzo sell the hay. He stood back and did not say anything while Almanzo showed the livery man the hay was good timothy and clover, clean and bright, and every bale solid and full weight. How much do you want for it? The livery man asked. $2.25 a bale, Almanzo said. I won't pay that price, said the livery man. It isn't worth it. What would you call a fair price? Almanzo asked. Not a penny over $2, the livery man said. All right, I'll take $2, said Almanzo quickly. The livery man looked at Father, and then he pushed back his hat and asked Almanzo why he'd asked the price at $2.25 in the first place. Are you taking it at $2? Almanzo asked. The liveryman said, "Well," Almanzo said, "I asked 2.25 because if I asked you 2, you wouldn't have paid but 1.75." The liveryman laughed and said to Father, "That's a smart boy of yours." "Time will show," Father said. "Many a good beginning makes a bad ending. It remains to be seen how he turns out in the long run." Father did not take the money for the hay. He let Almanzo take it and count it to make sure it was $60. Then they went to Mr. Case's store. This store was always crowded, but Father always did his trading there because Mr. Case sold his goods cheaper than the other merchants. Mr. Case said, "I'd rather have a nimble 6 pence than a slow shilling." So 6 pence was a type of money that wasn't worth a lot, and a shilling was an old type of money too, but it was worth more than 6 pence. Almanzo stood in the crowd with Father and waited while Mr. Case served first comers. Mr. Case was polite and friendly to everyone alike. He had to be because they were all customers. Father was polite to everyone too, but he was not as friendly to some as he was to others. After a while, Father gave Almanzo the pocketbook and told him to look for Mr. Thompson. Father must stay in the store to wait his turn. He could lose time if they were to get home. He could not lose time if they were to get home by chore time. No other boys were on the streets. They were all in school. Almanzo liked to be walking down the street carrying all that money, and he thought how glad Mr. Thompson would be to see it again. He looked at the stores and the barber shop and the bank, and he saw Mr. Thompson's team standing on the side street in front of Mr. Paddock's wagon shop. He opened the door of the long, low building and went in. Mr. Paddock and Mr. Thompson were standing by the round belly stove, looking at a piece of hickory and talking about it. It's a type of wood. Almanzo waited because he could not interrupt them. It was warm in the building, and there was a good smell of shavings and leather and paint. Beyond the store, 2 workmen were making a wagon, and another was painting thin red lines on the red spokes of a new buggy. The buggy glistened proudly in black paint. Long curls of shavings lay in heaps, and the whole place was as pleasant as a barn on a rainy day. The workmen whistled while they measured and marked and sawed and planed the clean-smelling wood. Mr. Thompson was arguing about the price of the new wagon. Almanzo decided that Mr. Paddock did not like Mr. Thompson, but he was trying to sell the wagon. He figured the cost with his big carpenter's pencil and soothingly tried to persuade Mr. Thompson. "You see, I can't cut the price any further and pay my men," he said. "I'm doing the best I can for you. I guarantee we'll make a wagon to please you, or you don't have to take it." "Well, maybe I'll come back to you if I can't do better elsewhere," Mr. Thompson said suspiciously. "Glad to serve you any time," Mr. Paddock said. Then he saw Almanzo and asked him how the piglet was getting along. Almanzo liked big, jolly Mr. Paddock. He always asked about Lucy. "She weighs about 150 now," Almanzo told him. Then he turned to Mr. Thompson and asked, "Did you lose a pocketbook?" Mr. Thompson jumped. He clapped his hand on his pocket and he fairly shouted, "Yes, I have. $1,500 in it, too." "What about it? What do you know about it?" "Is this it?" Almanzo asked. Yes, that's it," Mr. Thompson said, snatching the pocketbook. He opened it and hurriedly counted the money. He counted all the bills over twice, and he looked exactly like a man skinning a flea for its hide and tallow. Then he breathed a long sigh of relief and said, "Well, this darn boy didn't steal any of it." Almanzo's face was as hot as fire. He wanted to hit Mr. Thompson. Mr. Thompson thrust his skinny hand into his pants pocket and hunted around. He took something out. "Here," he said, putting it in Almanzo's hand. It was a nickel. Almanzo was so angry he couldn't see. He hated Mr. Thompson. He wanted to hurt him. Mr. Thompson called him a darn boy, and as good as called him a thief. Almanzo didn't want his old nickel. Suddenly, he thought what to say. "Here," he said, handing the nickel back. "Keep your nickel. I can't change it." Mr. Thompson's tight, mean face turned red. One of the workmen laughed a short, jeering laugh, but Mr. Paddock stepped up to Mr. Thompson angrily. "Don't you call this boy a thief, Thompson," he said, "and he's not a beggar either." "That's how you treat him, is it? When he brings you back your $1,500, you call him a thief and hand him a nickel, will you?" Mr. Thompson stepped back, but Mr. Paddock stepped right after him. Mr. Paddock shook his fist under Mr. Thompson's nose. "You measly skinflint," Mr. Paddock said. "Not if I know it, you won't. Not in my place." I'll show you, boy, he is upset. That was very rude of him. A good, honest deed, decent little chap, and you, for a cent, no. You hand him $100 of that money and do it quick. No, 200. $200, I say, or take the consequences. Mr. Thompson tried to say something, and so did Almanzo, but Mr. Paddock's fists were clenched and the muscles of his arms bulged. $200, he shouted. "Hand it over quick, or I'll see you do." Mr. Thompson shrank back, small and watching Mr. Paddock, and he licked his thumb and hurriedly counted off some bills. He held them out to Almanzo. Almanzo said, "Mr. Paddock, now get out of here if you know what's healthy." "Get out," Mr. Paddock said. And before Almanzo could blink, he was standing there with the bills in his hand, and Mr. Thompson slammed the door behind himself. Almanzo was so excited he stammered. He didn't think Father would like it. Almanzo felt queer about taking all that money, and yet he did want to keep it. Mr. Paddock said he would talk to Father. He rolled down his shirt sleeves and put on his coat and asked, "Where is he?" Almanzo almost ran to keep up with Mr. Paddock's long strides. The bills were still clutched tight in his hand. Father was putting packages into the wagon, and Mr. Paddock told him what had happened. "For a cent, I'd smash that sneering face," Mr. Paddock said. "Then it struck me that giving up cash is what hurts him most, and I figured the boy's entitled to it." "I don't know as anybody's entitled to anything more than common honesty," Father objected. "Though I must say I appreciate the spirit you showed, Mr. Paddock." "I don't say he deserved more than a gratitude for giving Thompson his own money," Mr. Paddock said. "But it's too much to ask him to stand there and take insults on top of that. I say Almanzo's entitled to that 200. "Well, there's something in what you say," Father said. Finally he decided, "All right, son, you can keep the money." Almanzo smoothed out the bills and looked at them. $200. That was as much as a horse buyer paid for one of Father's 4-year-old colts. "And I'm much obliged to you," Paddock said, "standing up for the boy the way you did." Paddock, "standing up for the boy the way you did," said Father. "Well, I can afford to lose a customer now and then in a good cause, said Mr. Paddock. He asked Almanzo, what are you going to do with all that money? Almanzo looked at Father. Could I put it in the bank, he asked. That's the place to put money, said Father. Well, $200. I was twice your age before I had that much. So was I. Yes, and older than that, Mr. Paddock said. Father and Almanzo went to the bank. Almanzo could just look over the ledge of the cashier sitting in his high stool with a pen behind his ear. Have you ever seen anybody do that? Just looking to see if I had a pen. I do. I used to see people do this a lot. They'd have the pen right there by their ear. That way, when they wanted it, they could pull it out and they had it. Cashier craned to look down at Almanzo and asked Father, hadn't I better put this down on your account, sir? No, said Father, it's the boy's money. Let him handle it himself. He won't learn any younger. Yes, sir, the cashier said. Almanzo had to write his name twice. Then the cashier carefully counted the bills and wrote Almanzo's name in a little book. He wrote the figures, $200, in the book, and he gave the book to Almanzo. Almanzo went out of the bank with his father and asked him, how do I get the money out again? You ask them for it, and they give it to you. But remember this, son, as long as that money's in the bank, it's working for you. Every dollar in the bank is making you 4 cents a year. That's a slight easier than you can earn money any other way. Anytime you want to spend a nickel, you stop and think how much work it takes to earn $1. Yes, Father, Almanzo said. He was thinking that he had more than enough money to buy a little colt. He could break a little colt of his own. He would teach it everything. Father would never let him break one of his colts. But this was not the ending to that exciting day. And that's the end of the chapter. Tomorrow's chapter will be the last one in this book. So I wonder what's going to happen so exciting. We'll find out tomorrow. Well, it's Maria from Still Dreaming Homestead. I want to pray blessings on you and on yours, in your house and out of your house, in the day and the night. And whatever you do, keep dreaming. Keep a story in your heart. All right, good night.